introduce our first presenter, Dr. Peg Hay. Peg has been in practice here almost 4 decades. I'm amazed because she doesn't look like she could possibly be that old. But she's been in private practice here since 1980 and was doing independent educational evaluations and presenting expert testimony at dyslexia hearings. She's got her doctorate in educational and school psychology, and she did her dissertation on cognitive predictors of the dyslexia syndrome. She's a lifetime member of the International Dyslexia Center, and she's a person who personally has made my journey through dyslexia much more manageable. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peg Hay.
Good work. It's nice to see so many of you here today. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of dyslexia, how it's gone down in terms of how people conceptualize it and how people have worked with dyslexic individuals. Anybody have an idea of what people thought dyslexia was a long, long time ago, like 1905? Anybody? It was thought of as a vision problem. And that dyslexic people saw everything backwards. It's kind of like thinking of hypnosis as it's got to be done by a person in a purple cape who waves a talisman in front of your face. Okay, so of course dyslexia is not a vision problem, but people who are dyslexic can have vision problems. There has been something going on in our country that are referred to as the reading wars. And basically, education in our country is pretty much controlled by publishers. And so what happens is you get these fads in education that kind of will run for like 10 or 15 years before everybody figures out that what they're doing isn't working. So, when talking about dyslexia, I want to talk about mostly today how we test for it and also what kinds of variants we see. I'm not going to go over all the variants because there's a lot of different combinations and permutations. I always say to parents, everybody's learning style is kind of like a fingerprint. And the big job with dyslexia is that you have to sort of be a detective and look for clues that might suggest that there's something going on. Now, why do we want to do that sooner than later? There's what we call a critical window of language development, which is roughly from birth to around 10 years of age. And that's when the child's brain is on a very rapid cycle of forming connections in the brain between neurons. If we catch dyslexic kids when they're in that critical window, and we do the right things instructionally, you can beat the disability in many cases. But the key is catching it early. And one of the things that happened as part of the reading wars is that the view was if somebody was struggling to learn how to read, or they were in kindergarten and they were having trouble identifying letters and making sound and symbol connections, the thought was take a wait-and-see approach, see if they grow out of it. And what would happen then is that kids wouldn't even get tested until after 3rd grade. So what would happen is that they wouldn't be identified or tested until they were already past the critical window. And what the research tells us now is that if we catch dyslexia early, and we do all the right things to address it from an instructional standpoint, we have a very good chance of having a milder problem or no problem later on. If we catch it after the critical window has closed, there's probably always going to be some kind of residue processing problem. So What is dyslexia actually? It's what we call a language-based learning disorder. What all dyslexics have in common are problems hearing the smallest unit of a word called phoneme. And that gives you a problem in learning how to read in our language because we take our speech sounds and we code them up with symbols. And it's a fairly sophisticated and complicated coding system where you have to hear the speech sounds and then you code them up with the symbols that attach to those speech sounds. But as we know, those symbols can vary in their pronunciation depending on the structure of the word. So one of the core problems in people with dyslexia is that they have trouble hearing the smallest units of sound in speech. And we call that phonological processing. Some early signs in a preschooler may be some delays in speech development. That can be one flag. Another sign can be word finding problems. You know what you want to say, but you can't put your finger on it. And a lot of these we see them developmentally in kids anyway. When kids are just learning how to speak, they have word finding problems, or they mispronounce a lot of words. So, in a person with dyslexia, it's a greater than normal problem in this area. Another area that is impacted is what we call working memory. Working memory isn't what you're going to remember for the rest of your life, but remembering something on the short term that you have heard. So, let's say that you have a little kid and you say, go upstairs, clean up your room, feed the cat, and come down and watch TV. Okay? Child with poor working memory goes upstairs and can't remember the rest of the list. And why is that important for understanding dyslexia? Well, we need working memory we sound out the words, but we have to remember the sound units in the sequence, in the correct sequence on the short term to decode that word or to spell that word. So one of the early symptoms of dyslexia is a problem with working memory on the short term. The child may have great long-term memory for things that they've learned, but the short-term memory is what's impaired. The other way that this plays out as you get older and you're a dyslexic person is that, like right now I'm giving you a lot of language information in the sequence. What happens with a dyslexic person is that they tend to overload in situations where too much language is coming at them at one time. So in certain lecture classes, where you've got a very fast-talking teacher, or you have a visiting professor from Pakistan, okay, accents can throw you in terms of processing the bits of language and retaining those pieces of information on the short term. So one of the things that we see with our older dyslexic students is that they often overload in certain listening situations, especially with fast speakers who talk at a very rapid rate and are speaking faster than they can process the language. And they also tend to have problems with foreign language acquisition. The same problems that affected learning how to read and spell in the English language become very significant as the child gets into middle school and high school and they're required to take a foreign language. By the way, the best foreign language to teach a dyslexic person is Latin, because it actually helps you with all the languages, including the English language. And Latin is the most mathematical of the languages. So where Latin can really help, usually I'll say to kids, if you can take Latin and your school requires a foreign language, go ahead and take it, but let's see if we can get you graded on a pass-fail basis, because it's probably going to be your lowest grade. And that way, you you can benefit from the instruction, but it's not going to trash your GPA when you get into the higher grades. Another key component of dyslexia is problems with rapid naming speed. When we read, we scan and track through print. And we have to scan and track and identify symbols on the page. One of the problems with dyslexia is that the scanning and tracking function slows down, and it takes longer to find the name of the letter or the number that you're looking at as you're going through. And where that has an impact is on reading fluency. What was that, a hamster? A guinea pig. I never heard that story. So, it's important to remember that not all dyslexics have all these problems. Dyslexia is almost kind of like a spectrum disorder where there can be sort of a little bit of it or a lot of it. And so where the processing breaks down becomes important to know, because when you're going to provide instruction, you want instruction that's going to address the problems, the processing problems that the person has. And that can mean different things. So the other kinds of problems we see are word finding, which I mentioned, auditory overload, which is too much language at one time. I'll give you a little trick. People process language at about the rate that they talk. So let's say that you're a speaker who goes 100 miles an hour when you're talking, and you go like this and you say, okay, get out your books, turn to page 35, write down each word, use it in a sentence, and hand it in. All right? Chances are that can put a lot of people on auditory overload because they're not able to process that sequence at the pace at which I just said that. Here's the trick. If you pace your speech to the rate of word finding of the person you're talking to, that's about the speed that you should be talking. So it's very important to know that when you're a teacher, because if you are a person who finds their words quickly and saying what you want to say, and you present information at a very rapid rate, you're going to be leaving increasing numbers of people behind who are not able to process the language at that rate. Then we have orthographic processing problems. Anybody know what that means? Orthographic? Yeah. Say it in symbols. Okay. We have two functions in reading. Actually, it's more complicated than that, but I'm going to boil it down into two main ones. Okay. One is, can you hear the smallest units of sound and remember those sound units in a sequence? The other one is what we call orthographic processing, which means, do you have stable perception of a symbol? Does a B always look like a B, or does it look like a D or a P or a Q? When you have two things going on, the phonological problem and the orthographic processing problems, we call that double deficit dyslexia. All right? Sort of like you have a double whammy where you have problems processing the speech sound, and you have trouble forming the sound and symbol connections. And so what it looks like is, it doesn't look like reading everything backwards. What it looks like is, you read the word correctly here, and 3 lines later you misread the same word. It's more haphazard. It's like good day, bad day, off and on. Okay. Something that can co-occur with dyslexia is dysgraphia, which is just Latin for lousy writing. But there are a lot of different components of dysgraphia. What do we have to do to access print and to produce printed symbols on a page? We have to be able to scan and track across lines of print. And some people do that very rapidly, and other people do it very slowly. There's no relationship between scanning and tracking and intelligence. Meaning you can be a really smart person who's not a fast scanner and tracker, or you can be a person who's not so smart who's really fast. Okay. Another component of dysgraphia is this, what we call graphomotor functioning. Holding the pencil or the writing instrument in your hand and putting information down on the page. I had a little guy in to see me this week who had one of those personalities that just, his personality was bigger than he was. And he's the kind of kid that you're going to know you're in the room with him because he's got this sort of like force of self. And when he wrote like this, and there was all this pressure and tension, but I mean, he would write, and after one sentence, his arm was ready to fall off. Graphomotor functioning is looking at your ability to control the writing instrument and to produce writing on a page without feeling constantly exhausted. Okay. So what happens with a lot of dysgraphic people is that, you know, they'll give you a test like a Bender or a visual motor integration test where you have to copy forms on the page. And the child may test perfectly in the normal range because they just did a test that takes you about 5 minutes to do. But what also becomes important is, can they continue to hit accuracy and work at a rapid rate of speed? Because in school, we're asking kids to be fast and accurate. And there's a lot of kids who are slow and accurate or fast and inaccurate. So they're in a double bind. If they go fast to try to keep up, they make more detail errors. If they slow themselves down to do it right, they can't get done on time. So it becomes a catch-22 where it's a lose-lose either way. Confusion of symbols affects writing, where you intend to write a D, but it comes out as a P. Trouble forming connections between speech sounds and symbols affects writing. In fact, one of the things that we see with, if you catch a dyslexic kid early, and you do all the right kinds of instruction right from the get-go, and I'm talking kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, you can actually beat the disability and produce a person who can spell. One of the reasons why dyslexic people tend to be horrible spellers is that a good speller remembers what the word should look like. But if you spell the word in multiple ways when you're a little kid, you don't have a way to look at the word and know if it's right or not. So when you get older, it's like you've stored up all these misspellings of words in your head, and you don't have an internal check system to know if it's correct or incorrect. So the longer the dyslexia goes undetected and unaddressed, the more likelihood it's going to be that you're going to develop a spelling problem. Typically, even if you catch a dyslexic person later in life, and I mean past the critical window, you can remediate the reading problem. But the spelling problem, if you're an older dyslexic kid, is probably going to stay that. It's not going to budge so much. Strength and endurance kind of goes with the graphomotor functioning. It's like how quickly you fatigue out because you don't have the muscle strength and fine motor. And then the slow processing speed, again, I've seen dysgraphic people who can print something and it'll look perfect. It'll just take them 10 minutes to write their name. So again, that's the sort of the dilemma between fast and inaccurate, slow and accurate, but then you run out of time. Okay, so this is a Lexia test from a boy that I saw in my office not too long ago. And Wechsler, one of the things we do in testing for dyslexia is we first want to look at how does the person learn and process information, and where do they hit the wall. So the way that we determine that is that we give tests that measure information processing. In this case, the Wechsler test is a test that allows you to figure out where the person is strong in their learning and where they bog down. Now the way we do that is that these subtests kind of fall into groups, okay? So let's look at the first group up here, which is similarities, vocabulary, information, and comprehension. Okay. Similarities and vocabulary are not in parentheses because they're called core subtests. They should always be given. Information and comprehension are optional tests. I like to give them because I like to figure kids out. Because I like the added information you get from those tests. And the verbal comprehension index is then the score of, it's your IQ score that's coming from these top core tests. So if we look at this profile, we report scores. The most accurate scores are what we call standard scores. Okay, the standard score shows where you are in relation to people of your age. So, for example, if you have a standard score of 112, standard scores have an average or a mean of 100. And they have what we call a standard deviation of 15 points, which is to determine how significantly different you are from average, either high or low. So a standard score of 112 in verbal comprehension would put you at the 75th percentile for your age. And what that means is that out of 100 people your age, you're better than 75 of them, and not as high as 25 of them. People like to look at percentiles because it's easy to understand. The problem with percentiles is that what we call the distribution gets kind of wacky as you get away from the mean. And so what happens is that you get these distortions in scores that you don't get with standard scores. But it is harder for people to understand a standard score. The subtests are reported in what we call scale scores. So a scale score of 14 is in the superior range. Okay, so this kiddo, he tests in the superior range with regard to verbal reasoning, his ability to understand verbal concepts. We often say kids with high similarity scores, we really want to catch them early and we really want to help them because they're the ones who are going to go on to college, graduate school, and higher learning because they have the ability to understand higher level concepts and ideas. So he's in the superior range. Vocabulary, you have to give definitions for words. Now the way we develop our vocabulary initially is from people talking to us. But once we get in school, our vocabulary knowledge really develops as a function of how good of a reader we are. And so, if you are struggling to read, oftentimes that vocabulary score will come down with the passage of time. This is called Matthew effect, okay? What it is that your IQ appears to be going down, but it's that you're not learning as much as people are learning to read. Because you're a struggling reader, so you're not learning as much, and you have to keep in mind that these scores come from comparing you to thousands of kids your age in North America. The information test, which is in parentheses an optional test, is a test of long-term memory for details, like how much you've stored up in your head, and if I ask you a question like, what are the 4 main directions on a map, you're going to tell me north, south, east, and west. Okay? And then comprehension is, it's kind of a hodgepodge of questions that have a lot of social implications, like what should you do if you see smoke coming out of the window of your neighbor's house? And we often find that kids who score low in comprehension may have trouble interpreting social situations or knowing what to do in various situations. So this kid has really good scores here in verbal comprehension. They're all at least average, which is your scale score of 10 at the 50th percentile, and they go up to superior. All right? If we look over here on the right, your block design and visual puzzles, these are kind of like builder tests. Your high block design score likes Legos, construction, engineering. They're good at like hands-on kinds of learning, as this boy was. And your visual puzzles is you're kind of looking at relationships of construction when you're working with concrete objects, and he's average there. So that looks good. Now, these top tier tests from here to here are really looking at the left side of your brain for the language and the right side of your brain for construction. All right? Those tests at the top are determining your cognitive horsepower, the horsepower of your brain on both sides. And the number we get is called the General Ability Index, which is your IQ for the top tier test, your left and right hemispheres of the brain. All right? So this person is scoring in the high average range here, in the average range here, and a cognitive ability index of 105 is saying he has average intelligence overall. Now, what do the other tests measure? These tests in here are what we call the working memory tests, right? Digit span is auditory working memory. Can you remember a series of things that you hear in the short term? That's at the 16th percentile, that's low. Picture span is, can you remember a series of things that you just looked at? That affects things like, can you remember how a word is spelled? Or can you remember your math facts? That's 25th percentile, lower end of that. And then letter number sequencing is your ability to form your sound and symbol connections. That's at the 9th percentile, right? This is a pretty standard dyslexia configuration. Remember, working memory has nothing to do with intelligence. But working memory is a core problem in dyslexia. When we get over here to these subtests, these are visual spatial tests, but they're kind of thinking outside of the box, and they're also, in some cases, looking at your ability to visually process symbols. You can be a great visual learner for building things, but not so visual when it comes to orthographic processing, okay? So matrix reasoning, you're working with symbol configurations. That comes down to 25th percentile. Arithmetic, you're doing math problems in your head, so you have to be able to see the problem in your head to solve it. The figure weights, you've got scales that you're balancing out. That was average. And picture concepts, you're looking at pictures that you have to find like the logical connection between them. So even though these scores overall are in the average range, there are some slight weaknesses here, and so we would expect to see some problems with symbols to some degree for this kid. These tests down here, coding and symbol search, are your secretarial tests. Again, no relationship between these scores and your intelligence. Okay? Your coding test is looking at clerical speed and accuracy. You're having to copy things down on the page. And your symbol search is looking at your scanning and tracking speed. How quickly and accurately you can scan and track across print and identify symbols. That comes down here at the 5th percentile. Okay? So you'll see that the full-scale IQ, where we take everything into account, comes down to 90. The general ability index is the cognitive horsepower of the right and left hemispheres. That's 15 points higher, which is statistically significant. Okay? This is a smart kid who is going to have trouble processing sound units that affect being able to decode a word to read or encode a word to spell. He's going to get symbols mixed up, and he can't keep up with the writing, the written work. So he's in this double line. Does he go fast and be inaccurate, or does he slow down and try to be more accurate? Either way, he's in trouble. So down here you have some aggregate numbers. Working memory and the auditory part comes out around 10% percentile. That's from looking at these two subtests, the digit span and the letter number. Your cognitive proficiency is your speed of processing this information. And this is one of the residual problems for a lot of people, people who have dyslexia, who have gone through remediation, and they're reading at a level that we want them to be. Oftentimes, they're reading accurately and they're comprehending okay, but they're not fast. So one of the residual problems as you get older is keeping up, where you need extra time on the test, for example, or you need a shortening of assignments, or when you go through college, you need to take more than 4 semesters to finish a 4-year degree because you don't have enough hours in the day to do everything. Okay, so any questions about that? There are different tests we use, but I just want to give you sort of a flavor of what we're trying to do is figure out how a person learns and processes information. Yeah?
How old is the child?
This boy is 10 years old. Yeah. So he's being compared to kids who are also his age. And he is in a public school program where he's getting ready to, he's in, I believe it's 5th grade, and he'll be going to 6th grade next year, which is middle school. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, this kid is majorly dyslexic and a smart kid. The job of elementary school is to learn how to read, spell, and do arithmetic, right? Once you get into middle school and high school, you're going to get a whole lot of content coming at you, and you better have those basic skills down or you're going to be stuck. So the reason his parents brought him in for testing was because they said, we know he's dyslexic. They said there's nothing more they can do in the public school to try to help him. And we're worried about him going to middle school next year because we don't, our other kids, we saw him what the workload was, we don't know how this kid's going to do it. The school told them, we don't have any services for anybody once they get out of elementary school. Which isn't true, it is illegal, but I pretty much heard it all. I was once called satanic because I used the word dyslexia. Yeah.
If you provide really good remediation in that critical window period.
Can you come up with your question just so everybody can hear it? Because this room is kind of... Yeah. That's okay.
If you provide really effective remediation in that critical window period, is it ever possible for a dyslexic to be able to be a 4-year college student?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So, what happens is we use a test like the Webster or Woodcock-Johnson to give us clues about processing. But then, when we get the clues, we get the flags in those tests that tell us that all is not okay. Normally what we do is retest to make sure that our assumptions are correct. Okay, because what we want to do is give multiple measures to make sure that we're on the right track in this investigation here. So, for example, One test we use a lot is called the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, which basically is a test. You're being compared to other people of your age, and we're looking at 3 areas. One is, can you hear the small units of sound called a phoneme? The next one is, can you remember those sound units in a sequence in your short-term memory? And the third one is your rapid naming speed. Can you rapidly scan and track through friends? When we look at auditory working memory, that's going to come out of your Wexler or your Woodcock-Johnson. Woodcock-Johnson is another gold standard test that we use to look at how a person learns and processes information. Orthographic processing, where we're looking at symbols, one that we can use is a Jordan. We're giving the child tasks like they look at a page of letters and numbers and they have to find the ones that go backwards. The test of orthographic competence is a test that looks at how well are you dealing with symbols in an educational sphere. You have sentences, you have to punctuate them. You have abbreviations, you have to write down what the abbreviation means. You have a test that really drives dyslexic kids berserk, where you've got 4 letters at the top of the page, B, D, P, and Q, and you have a fragment of a word like blank ED, and you have to pick one of those letters that makes that a real word. And you have 2 minutes to do it. Okay. So if you get your B's, D's, P's, and Q's mixed up, it really slows you down in doing that task. There's another one where the letters are scrambled up in the word, you have to unscramble them. There's another one where we're working with homophones, like where we have whale the mammal versus whale the screaming. And we have a picture of whale the mammal, and we have to say which one is spelled correctly. Or it refers to what you're looking at. Word finding in demand language situations. What I mean by that is we have speech that comes out of our own heads where we're talking about stuff that we're thinking about. A demand language situation is when somebody asks you a question. How well can you go in and pull out the answer and retrieve the information that's in there? When people have word finding problems and you ask them questions, you frequently will get like a deer in the headlights look. Okay, or you'll have using the wrong word to say what you want to say. This is an associated problem with dyslexia. And what we often see on with the YF3, which is an achievement test, is that we have a test of listening called oral discourse comprehension. And what you're doing is you're listening to somebody say something on an audio tape, and then you're being asked a question about what they just said. A lot of dyslexic people will go on overload on that test and not be able to answer the question of what the person just said. And the way that looks in the classroom is, it looks like attention deficit, all right? This is a separate type of problem that has to do with your frontal lobe functioning. But if you have problems in working memory, you miss directions and instructions, you miss things that people say in a lecture. And so what do? You ask the person next to you, what page are we supposed to be on? That sort of thing. And so it can often look like attention deficit when in fact it's the processing problem. Foreign language aptitude. Sarah Page, you're going to talk about that? Most people with language-based learning disorders, dyslexia, have trouble with foreign language acquisition just like they do with English language acquisition. I can tell you right now, if you've got a dyslexic kid, do not put them in a Spanish immersion class. Because it'll confuse them more with the English language and will slow down the progress that they're going to make in learning how to read and spell in the English language. There was a court case, I think it was with Boston College, where there was a requirement to take a foreign language as part of the four-year degree. And some people with dyslexia sued the school and said, if you have dyslexia, you shouldn't have to take a foreign language. There is a test called the Modern Language Aptitude Test, which is, I swear, the worst test that anybody can ever take on the planet. It's an hour long. It's on a pre-recorded tape that is, there's nothing modern about it. You can hear the door slamming in the background and everything else. And it's all given in the Kurdish language, where you're given these instructions and told how to understand the Kurdish language, and then you have to take these multiple choice tests to answer these questions. And that's the test that is the main gateway for getting a foreign language waiver in college as well as in high school. And so oftentimes if kids are in a school where there is a foreign language requirement, the only corollary to this is that if you major in a foreign language, you have to take it. But if it's not your major and it isn't material to your major, then they have to give you a waiver and let you take substitute courses. There are a lot of people who went through school and went right up to their degrees but didn't finish them because they couldn't pass the foreign language requirement. In your ability to make sound and symbol connections, we talked about that with the WISC and also with Johnson for graphic motor functioning. We look at things like strength of grip and hand and coordination and things that occupational therapists look at. Okay, in terms of subtypes, there are a lot of different categorizations of dyslexia that have sort of developed over time. None of these are used all that much now because they tend to throw a lot of people, but basically what we're looking at is, do you have the language piece of dyslexia, which is hearing the phonemes, remembering auditory information on the short term, and it affects your ability to decode a word when you're reading and to encode a word when you're spelling. So dysphonetic dyslexia is referring to that phonological piece, which most dyslexic people have. Dysidetic dyslexia is that visual piece where you get your symbols mixed up, you have trouble making the relationships between the sounds and the symbols, and this tends to also give you trouble with math. And if you think of it, when we read, we're reading in one direction and we're doing math in another direction. So if you get your lefts and rights mixed up, and you get your symbols mixed up, it will often affect the math as well. Usually, if you have the phonological part of dyslexia, it's going to affect your literacy skill development. If you also have the symbol confusion part, it's going to affect math as well. Okay. Academic impact. You have trouble pronouncing the words out loud or sounding them out accurately. What do dyslexic people tend to do? They usually guess at words, so they might see the word canoe and say cannot. But a lot of dyslexic people, in fact most dyslexic people, are really smart. And so what they learn to do is they take educated guesses based on context cues. If I see the word canoe in isolation, I might call it cannot. If I see the word canoe in something I'm reading about Hiawatha, I'm more likely to guess canoe. And a lot of education, as part of the reading course, really focus on that logic piece to say, people don't really need to learn how to read. If you just give them things to read, they'll figure out the sound and symbol connections. And what you should have them do is guess at words that they can't decode. Now, that was part of a type of instructional fad that went on called whole language, and lots of people were trained in whole language. And what happened with whole language instruction is that the key was providing the child with good opportunities to read a lot of stuff. It didn't teach you how to read. Now, 5% of kids who go into kindergarten and first grade know how to read when they get there. The other 95% have to learn. They have to be taught how to do it. And reading in our language is a very mathematical type of process. So what happened with whole language instruction is we produced this whole crop of kids who were really lousy readers and spellers because they didn't learn how to decode and encode. What they learned was how to take educated guesses at words in text that they already had familiarity with. So it's one of the bad habits we have to break of dyslexic older kids, because they're guessing and they're logicking the information out to the point that they can get average comprehension scores when they're reading. But what they're doing is they're taking guesses and they're basing it on their prior knowledge. Now, what's the problem with that? It means you can only read something that you're familiar with. You can't use reading to learn something new, because you can't decode those words to learn something new. I'm just going to check my time here and see where. Can somebody give me a time? What time?
10 o'clock.
Okay, thanks. Foreign language acquisition, the problem with dyslexics, auditory overload we talked about. What appear to be attention deficits. Attention deficits have to do with frontal lobe dysfunction, but there are problems, processing problems that can mimic attention deficit. If you have visual problems and your eyes are not converging onto a target in the page, what happens is you become fatigued very quickly when you're working with print. This isn't dyslexia, by the way. This is a vision problem. You become very fatigued and you run out of gas and you start becoming more inaccurate because you're not converging. All right? You can be dyslexic and have functional vision system problems. It's two separate things. It's not one or the other. But if you're having trouble clearing print and processing printed information on the page, what happens is that your attention begins to wax away. You're looking out the window, you're looking at other things, you're doing other things, and so it causes symptoms of distractibility. Same with the auditory overload. If you didn't get all the information down, you're likely to be asking somebody around you, and then you're getting accused of talking when you're supposed to be listening. Math you mentioned with the symbol processing problems, usually capitalization and punctuation skills are more difficult to establish, and right now there's a lot of instruction in these areas that have just not been emphasized. I mean, penmanship is like no longer a thing that is emphasized in school. Punctuation and capitalization, a lot of kids just aren't learning the rules for how to capitalize and punctuate. They're not being instructed. Slow reading and writing, need for extra time, and trouble keeping up, because what happens when you're in elementary school, the teacher teaches the kids, right? Once you go to middle school and high school, the teachers are teaching their subjects. And they're responsible to deliver a certain amount of content in a certain amount of time. So oftentimes kids who are doing, keeping their head above water in elementary will sink quickly when they make that middle school transition. Okay, this is the same kid, the 10-year-old. And these are his scores on the achievement test, okay? Now you might have to flip back in your notes to the ability test, but if you remember what we talked about on the ability test is that the student had high ability on the subtest that involved language processing, right? Okay, so what do we get? Listening comprehension, there's two tests. Okay, one is receptive vocabulary. He has to hear a word and look at 4 pictures and pick the one that indicates the meaning of the word. Fine, he's right up where he should be. He's right up consistent with that higher IQ. Oral discourse comprehension is where he's listening to the information being read in a text on the CD and he has to answer comprehension questions, he was okay. On the oral expression test, there's 3 of those. Expressive vocabulary, no, oral word fluency, let me go up there. Expressive vocabulary, he has to find the word to say what he wants to say. He was good. Oral word fluency, name as many animals as you can in a minute, name as many colors as you can in a minute, no problem. Sentence repetition skills, repeat back verbatim what I just said to you. That's your directions and instructions, that goes well. Okay, here we are in the reading test. Now keep in mind, this is a kid who had full-scale IQ of, I think the general ability index was like 105 and the full-scale IQ was 90. Okay? So what we say is, if your intelligence is up there between 90 and 105, and you learned an academic skill commensurate with your ability, your standard scores on the achievement test should be between 90 and 105. Okay, look at where his was. Word reading was in the 5th percentile. He's in 5th grade, he's 3 years behind. Pseudo-word decoding, he has to sound out nonsense words. He's at a beginning 1st grade level. He's not even out of the starting point. He's in 5th grade. Oral reading fluency. He's got to read out loud and we're timing how long it takes him. He's slow reader. Oral reading accuracy, when he reads out loud for us, we hear all the mistakes in what he's reading. Reading comprehension is average. What's he doing? He's relying on context cues, okay? He's reading and rereading the information to try to answer the comprehension questions. And he can get there, but it takes him a really long time to do it. So basically, we have really severe weaknesses here in your basic reading skills and your reading fluency. This kid goes to middle school, he's in really hot water because he's not able to read his books. Okay, let's look at the math. This is a kid who had some problems with symbols. Your math, reasoning, and math calculations skills, they're in the average range, but they're significantly weak for a kid with an IQ of 105 on the general ability index. The speed of recalling addition facts, recalling subtraction facts, and doing multiplication problems is slow. So this is a kid who, can sit there and struggle to pull up the basic math facts. This is where you want to shift into a calculator because there's no point in trying to beat them into his head at this point. You want him to be able to learn the math and go forward. Writing doesn't look too good here. But on the sentence composition, he's got a high and a low. Okay? One sentence combining. The sentences are already pre-printed, and he has to put those sentences together to make one sentence that tells you the same thing. Well, there's a smart dyslexic kid. He knows how to copy the stuff down and give you what you want. But in sentence building, he has a word, and he has to come up with a sentence to use that word. Well, he comes up with sentences that don't make any sense because he's not able to figure out what the single word is. On the essay, he's not writing a lot. He's not generating a lot of text. His spelling is low, around early 3rd grade level, which is functionally illiterate. Okay, so written expression and reading are severely affected. In math, less so, but still a problem. So basically, when we are evaluating for dyslexia, I just want to give you this short little tour to sort of let you know the process of how we investigate. Number one, you go through all the history and you get as much information as you can up front. Number two, you do the testing you need to do to figure out, does this person have information processing problems? And if so, what are they? Why do we want to know that? If we know what the processing problems are, we know what to do instructionally. If we don't know what the processing problems are, we can just be picking any reading method off the shelf. We want to know if there's an academic impact to the processing problems. There is such an animal as a compensated dyslexic. What is that? That's a dyslexic person who's reading and spelling and writing commensurate with their ability, but they're not fast, oftentimes. They have remediation, they've developed the basic skills, but usually fluency will still be a problem. One of the ways to determine if it's a learning disability is to look at, is the child achieving commensurate with age and grade? Another way is to look at, is there a discrepancy between what you see as the ability and where the achievement is? Okay? This kid who I used as the example is showing us big discrepancies between ability and achievement. His cognitive horsepower is fine. He should be in a college prep curriculum in middle school and high school. But somebody has to teach this kid how to read, write, and spell, because his literacy skills he's in a range of functional literacy, which is below a third grade level. SDI means specially designed instruction. What an IEP is supposed to consist of is two things, okay? One is, what kind of instruction do we have to give this student because these problems are there? And how often do we have to do it, and how do we measure to see if it works? So what an IEP should really be is a blueprint that says, this is what we're going to do, and this is how often we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to determine if it's getting us anywhere. All right? An IEP also has a second column, which are accommodations. If you don't have to take a foreign language, that's an accommodation. If you get extra time on your test, that's an accommodation. If somebody reads the test to you, that's an accommodation. So SDI is remediation. The other piece, accommodations, is your basically how to cut corners to try to level the playing field with the student. What they were doing with this kid is they were giving him all his tests orally, so he had straight A's on his report cards. He just hadn't learned to read and write, which is fundamental to any type of educational success or success in the world. So what we want to do is figure out how big is the gap between ability and achievement, and what do we have to accomplish? And that's where the recommendations become important, because if you are not using methods, like let's say that you decide to use a reading program that emphasizes comprehension. That isn't what this kid needs. He knows how to comprehend language. His problem is he can't decode it, he can't encode it. And he can't do those things automatically either. So you need to pick from your methods methodology that has a reasonable chance of succeeding in getting the student to where they need to be. The accommodations that we can put into place can be like, normally when you're going into middle school, we're wanting you to do two things. We're wanting to remediate the skill deficits to the extent we can, and we're also wanting to train in using technology so that you look good when you write. In this country, about 96% of your grades come from what you write. You can be the smartest kid in the class, but if you're not getting your homework done and you're not producing the information and writing that you need, it trashes your grades. So what we want to do is we want to teach how to use the tools so that you can compensate for those deficits that still are there. Another test that I use a lot, especially for high school and college students, are the Nelson-Denning reading test. The Nelson-Denning is a test that looks kind of like the SAT and the ACT. It's a Scantron answer sheet. You're reading individual vocabulary terms, and you get 15 minutes to do the test. Okay. This kid with a standard score should say 97. He was at a standard score of 97, which is a percentile of 42 at a 9th grade, 9.6 grade level. This is a different kid, by the way, than the one we were talking about before. This is a high school student. So, reading was okay. It was in the average range. He didn't finish the tests, though. So down here, we let him finish the vocabulary test. This is what he did in 15 minutes. He's at a 9.6 grade level. Here's what he did when we let him finish. He goes up to a 13.7 grade level. Right? This is a person who knows how to read and knows how to comprehend, but isn't fast and needs the extra time. So I use this a lot when I'm trying to get accommodations for SAT and ACT and those standardized tests, because I can show, do we need time and a half, do we need double time, what are we going to need so that this person can demonstrate what they know as opposed to the artifact of the fluency problem. Comprehension was low here. Had to read paragraphs and answer comprehension questions. A lot of reading and rereading necessary, so it was only testing at a 4.1 grade level in 20 minutes. When we let him finish the test, it's like double that, more than double. He's at a 9.3 grade level in comprehension. So the total reading score goes from 6.8 to 11.3. Well, that's a really big difference. So this is how the time can affect your performances on those high-stakes tests like the SAT and the ACT. The reading rate, we have to read the comprehension piece silently for 1 minute to calculate the rate. Okay, so I attached a couple articles, and I think they're also on the website. A really good book is Overcoming Dyslexia, Sally Shanewitz's book. I also have information on the Pennsylvania Department of Ed Dyslexia Literacy Prevention Program. Even though you still may hear in school there is no such thing as dyslexia, or we don't use that word. Dyslexia has been in our regulations since 1990, and there are programs in the state of Pennsylvania that are just designed to address the needs of dyslexic people. The Yale Center is also a really good resource for information. And the D word, the dyslexia word, Jill had said she wasn't sure why people would use the terminology or something like that. Basically, if you use the word dyslexia and you are in public school, you have to provide specially designed instruction that is geared to meet the needs of a dyslexic person. So if you don't call it that, then you don't have to address it in any specific way. Dyslexia is the most common learning disability we ever see. It affects 20% of the population. It tends to be inherited. And what can happen is there are certain pathways that are looked at in the transmission in terms of brain-based studies. But the key is we want to identify early, we want to do the right instruction from the get-go. That's where we up our chances of success. So thank you for your time.